What happens when we do start to take losses? What happens if we lose any capital ships? What happens when the bases that we occupy are blown up?
Douglas Macgregor recently went on Glenn Deason's podcast to talk about the worst ramifications that could befall the U.S. for supporting this perilous and insane war that Israel's launched against Iran, and also why truth is always in short supply in times of war. So let's watch, let's react. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Well, all this talks about weapons of mass destruction and being met as liberators, it all sounds awfully lot like 2003 with Iraq. But unlike Iraq, the United States had massive ground forces, and also the technical and military capabilities were overwhelming.
Well, if I may just stop you briefly, and I would tell
Yeah.
you that had we just gone into Iraq in 2003 and removed Saddam Hussein, then turned the country over to the nation's military leaders and urged them to invite the United Nations in to help supervise the restoration of government and elections and so forth, and then left, we would have been very successful.
Yeah, maybe more relatively to what happened. Of course, it would be better for the U.S. not to have invaded Iraq at all, and probably Iranian and Shiite influence would have poured in and maybe overtaken whoever the U.S. left power to. But yeah, it was way better of an option to do what Macgregor just suggested than a 20-year occupation, in the end killing 1 million Iraqis, depleting the treasury, creating enormous amounts of debt, and, failing to overcome Iraq in the end. We obviously left. ISIS took over. Fundamentalists now hold the country. And it's just a play.
Certainly in the South, when we came in, the Shiites were very happy to see us. There's no question about it. But then they kind of hoped that we would leave. This is the problem. Benjamin Franklin used to say, guests in your house like fish after 2 or 3 days stink. The point is that it's one thing to welcome somebody to come in and remove somebody else for you and then leave, versus somebody comes in, removes who was there, and then ultimately turns out to be worse than what you had and kills large numbers of you in the process. So, you're right, Iraq and Iran are different, but we need to understand what we did in 2003 that was very stupid. We occupied. You never occupy if you can avoid it. And there was no reason to occupy in Iraq. There was no reason to dismantle the government, its administration. And we need to remember who was responsible for that. His name is Paul Wolfowitz.
Yeah, that's right. Wolfowitz is an arch villain. He was the deputy secretary of defense to Rumsfeld, preeminent neocon, one of the most influential neocons, played a big role in founding the Project for a New American Century, which was the predominant neocon think tank by the way back then. And yeah, just arch villain. Macgregor is right here. People sometimes point to the success of some occupations like Japan or Germany. And it's like, well, yeah, they didn't have like 40 years, 50 years of animosity toward the United States. Also, they have, a more similar culture to the United States. There are reasons why they didn't turn out to be bloodbaths, prolonged, insane bloodbaths. And we're living with the ramifications of, long-term regime change operations and occupations today. And everyone that supports them always looks back to the World War II example and the Marshall Plan. Look at how successful this was. Look at how successful this was. But let's not point out anything that's happened in the 80 years since that has gone catastrophic, when that seems to be more likely to be the plausible scenarios and not the exceptions to the rules.
And that little coterie of people that took over the Pentagon, intelligence, and everything else in the Bush administration that were insistent that the road to Jerusalem and freedom went through Baghdad. I mean, just imagine what an asinine statement. But that's what they said. The same kinds of people, exactly the same, pushed the war in Ukraine against Russia. They are pushing the war now on behalf of Israel against Iran. We were always going to be involved in this fight because there is no alternative to our participation. Only complete failure and eventually destruction of Israel. So we had to come in on this fight. By the way, the same financial interests in London and New York City that wanted to destroy Russia, destroy its state, destroy the government, turn it into a globalist paradise, introducing millions of non-Europeans into Russia. The same globalists who wanted to strip Russia of its resources. They are the ones who want to get control of the oil and gas resources in the Middle East, and especially in Iran.
Yeah, the military-industrial complex is in bed with the bureaucracy and the State Department and the deep state and the Israel lobby. They all want to try to monopolize resources and grant special trade privileges for their friends to benefit at the expense of their enemies, but it just ends up bad for the U.S. taxpayer that has to bankroll it. They don't have to bankroll this. They just extort the money from us to fund it, or they inflate the currency to finance it. And it's disastrous. The U.S. shouldn't get sucked into this stuff. We just inherit all of the enemies of Israel, which is most of the Middle East, by the way, over time, under this mad expedition of a greater Israel. It's just madness and loony, and we want no part of it.
And they want to break it up into small parts that they can then treat as vassal states of the greater Israeli state, which in reality is a vanguard for the globalist victory that they're hoping to achieve in the Middle East.
Yeah, I remember the Iraq being the pathway to Iran, but how possible is it to, again, Trump set this very high goal of complete surrender on the Iranians, but with merely airstrikes and naval assets, this seems to be somewhat difficult, but also because how do you enter Iran? Would the Americans attack through the same corridor of Israel uses through Syria and Iraq, or would the United States attack from the sea? But if so, they can't get into the Persian Gulf, and it's still unclear to what extent perhaps even Pakistan would help intercept any missiles launched against Iran. Again, so far it's all speculations, but there's many of the neighbors who are not quite happy about this scenario. So, but if the goal is simply to make Iran one big Gaza to inflict much punishment, what can be done, and what can be expected of retaliatory attacks? I mean, has the United States moved many of its strategic assets away from vulnerable places? Does it still have the fleet in Bahrain, or has I guess what preparations are being made?
My understanding is that all the U.S. military personnel have been removed from Bahrain. I think we're trying to move U.S. uniformed and intelligence personnel to safe places in the region, or at least places that are unlikely to be attacked. How many have we managed to move at this point? I don't know. I think that's also had an impact on delaying the operation. But Bahrain, which is a very important place to the United States, particularly the United States Navy and Air Force, that has been evacuated. But I think the larger issue is much more straightforward. We have to understand what these goals mean. And then we have to ask ourselves, first of all, does this make any sense? I don't think it makes any sense. I think it's insane. And I've opposed this kind of thinking from the beginning. We don't live in the Eastern Hemisphere. We're Americans. We live in the Western Hemisphere. What are we doing? What are we trying to do? Is this going to improve the situation for Israel? I don't think so, because the loss that I think is inevitable in this contest will make it very hard for Israel to survive.
Yeah, and always when talking about this war, it's always through the perspective of Israel. And it's kind of eerie if you're an American looking at this, you're an actual America that believes in real America First principles, and you're hearing people perceive this conflict and whether the U.S. should enter always on the side of Israel. What I mean by this is they say, well, Israel can't take the chance that, Iran is not enriching uranium to the level that they can make a bomb, or Iran's chanting death to Israel. How should Israel respond? Well, let them respond, but without our treasury, without us bankrolling it. And it's just so weird for people to say this and just recognize that Iran doesn't even have remotely the capability to deliver missiles to North America to strike us. This is all for Israel. It's all for Netanyahu. Trump seems to be duped by it to some extent. And every corporate media shill for the Israel lobby always talks about, but what does this mean for Israel? Well, they're not my country. At some point, it just becomes obvious they're not my country. Other people that are Americans and also taxpayers, they have preferred states throughout the world, nations throughout the world that they like much more than Israel. Why shouldn't we bankroll them? I say we don't bankroll any of them.
And if they try to threaten the use of a nuclear weapon, if we don't do what they want us to do, or if any of their neighbors don't do what they tell them to do, they'll end up being on the receiving end of a nuclear weapon. These things have a bad habit of showing up in other people's hands. So I wouldn't write it off. Just because Iran hasn't built a nuclear weapon doesn't mean one couldn't become available if the Israelis threaten that.
That's true. I think Pakistan might be the most likely. They're a Sunni Muslim nation, though, and them giving it to a Shiite regime sounds like that may not happen, but who knows? But he's right to say that there's other powers, even close proximity to where this is all happening, that have nukes that could disseminate them elsewhere.
But here's the key thing, and you've come back to this again and again. We are not a continental power. Neither is Israel. Israel is a small colony that sits on the Mediterranean. And it is acting as though it's a great power because it has unconditional support from us. And we think that we can do to Iran what we plan to do to Russia. The entire global South is coming on side with Iran. Many European states are going to come on side with Iran that haven't done so yet. And then, of course, you have the usual suspects, India, China, BRICS, everybody involved in that are going to side with Iran. And more technology, equipment, and support is coming into Iran. The only thing we in the United States will achieve as a result of our actions is to become a pariah state all over the world. We're going to be hated and despised for what we're doing.
Indeed, Iran's a BRICS nation and particularly close to Russia in that alliance, which jeopardizes prospects for peace there. Putin's watching this. He sees the duplicity involved in luring Iranians into nuclear negotiations only to smack them in the face in a sneak attack where Trump at least was complicit for a few days. I mean, who's going to negotiate with someone like that in good faith? It just seems like it's not trustworthy unless you have more will to end the war than is generally thought. And that might not be the case. So I think this jeopardizes our relationship with Russia. Maybe China, too. It's a BRICS country. China's not particularly close with Iran, and they have a vested interest in receiving natural gas from Iran and oil. So they don't want, the Strait of Hormuz to get clogged up or attacks that would, break down the production of oil either. So there's many different dynamics going on, and it's weird to kind of see how some of them have shifted. Syria's lending aid to Israel and using its territory to stage attacks from, I understand. But there's many other considerations that haven't played out yet. We'll have to see. We'll have to watch them.
We already are, but it's only going to get worse because the war is going to get worse. Now, will the war last a week, 12 months, 18 months, 10 days? I suppose a lot of that depends on the destruction. And right now, the destruction on the ground in Israel is substantial. And you have to ask yourself the question, 92 million people in an area the size of Western Europe versus far fewer than the 7+ million that live there normally in an area a little smaller than New Jersey. Who is going to come out on top? Can the aircraft carrier battle groups and the United States Air Force make a profound difference to that outcome? I'm skeptical.
My last question though is to what extent, how do you see the possibility of Trump changing his mind in terms of not attacking directly? Because I spoke earlier today with John Mersheimer. He believed that Trump might change his mind now because, they weren't able to do this decapitation strike. Iran proves to be much more powerful than expected. It turns out, this is a huge punishment for Israel. It's doubtful how much more they can absorb. And also, there's a huge pushback, not just among the American public, but also Trump's base and his own team. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, she does not seem happy with any of this.
That seems to have changed with Tulsi recently tweeting that, she's aligned with Trump and they're weeks away all of a sudden after 6 weeks ago putting in her annual report that there's no evidence that Iran even restarted its nuclear weapons program. 6 weeks ago, she said that, and they don't have one and they're not acquiring one. Unless yesterday she tweeted they're weeks away. So she seems to have turned on that. But I'm with Glenn. This does seem to have caused a schism in the MAGA coalition, which isn't completely united on foreign policy, by the way. Trump attracted a lot of dissidents to his coalition that wanted to be more non-interventionist, and others in his coalition that are pro-Israel no matter what, Israel first. So that's a big consideration. I think Macgregor believes that the decision's already been made, that the U.S. will strike, but we'll see what he says.
Do you think any of this will be able to convince him to change his ways, or you think the decision has definitely been made to attack?
I stand by what I said at the beginning. That decision has been made. And asking Donald Trump to retreat from that is very, very difficult. We have a bad habit historically of making policy pronouncements that are unrealistic, that involve overreach, and then we can't retreat from them. We went through that with Lyndon Johnson in 1965 and for 3 years in Vietnam until finally he left office. You can't do business that way, but we do, because President Trump is largely impulse and emotionally driven, and he's influenced by his supposition that we today are the nation we were in 1991. We're not. In other words, he looks through the window at the White House, out across the Washington Monument, and the beauty that he sees, and he sees what he believes to be unchallenged power, prosperity, that makes any contest with anybody, a foregone conclusion, especially against a state that he's being told is a backwater, led by this strange old man wearing a black turban. How could he take that seriously?
Yeah, I'm with Macgregor on this. He's right when he says that the U.S. isn't the same country as it was in 91. Certainly our technology, our military, technology has improved drastically. But since then, we've gone from a unipolar world where the U.S. was the sole superpower of the world to a multipolar world where there's many other rising powers and powers that have already risen, many that have nuclear weapons, and many that are more than willing to fund proxies to fight us in many directions. So Iran is one of them, by the way, a BRICS country that no doubt Russia will be funding in its own proxy war versus the United States. And to be clear, if I was a Russian, I wouldn't want my country to fund a proxy war because it embroils the same tensions on the other side and the same calamities that we experience as Americans. And we've seen nothing more than calamity in terms of U.S. support for Ukraine. It's been fruitless. It's been senseless. Many months have gone by, more than 3 years at this point, very few territorial changes. They have martial law. They have a president that won't do elections because they're in wartime. He's squashed dissent. He's shut down newspapers. He's eliminated other political parties. He's expanded conscription. And we're supposed to just bankroll all this forever, indefinitely, against a nuclear power? It's just absurd. And we could see that going in this war, too. Who knows what will happen if the U.S. doesn't put boots on the ground? And there's never been a regime change just from airstrikes. So if it's just airstrikes, I'm against it for obvious reasons I've talked about. But that won't cause regime change. That alone won't. And no one wants to put boots on the ground that's a serious anti-war activist and that's sensible about foreign policy.
So I don't see him changing his mind. I see no evidence for that at all. And I think he's going to carry through on this. Now, you mentioned something else that I think is very important to explore. You said, look at all the pushback in the United States. I don't see it. The American people aren't paying that much attention. The average American is worried about whether or not he can get a six-pack of beer tonight and watch the game on TV. As long as he can afford gas for his car and he goes to work without disruption, doesn't make a great deal of difference to him. And remember that he believes that war is something that happens on someone else's soil. Now, he can be rapidly convinced that he's wrong if things go badly here at home in the United States. We just admitted an estimated 30 million people into the country about whom we know absolutely nothing. There is no strategy for mass deportation.
And this jeopardizes whatever he would want to push in that direction, by the way. I really think that. I really think causing a schism among his activist base, because I think Macgregor's generally right about that. Most Americans don't care that much about foreign policy, but the activist base sure does. And you can tell that just from spending 5 minutes on Twitter. This is all people are talking about right now in political Twitter. For the most part, there is some other tangential issues, but he's right. Most Americans, as long as they don't see their prices rapidly jacked up, they might have that mentality. But we'll have to see. I think this is causing something of a schism, and he can't afford to lose the coalition he has to push for mass deportation or tariffs or whatever else, what have you, that he wants to push. And this is not me supporting that or refuting that in this case. I'm just saying that this really threatens his agenda in serious ways, more than anything else he's done, more than fumbling on the Epstein files and not delivering on those, more than his schism with Musk, more than anything else. If he really strikes and the U.S. takes a lead role in this war, I think it will destroy that alliance.
Assets for it don't exist. This is all being badly handled. The man who's in charge, this Mr. Homan, is focusing, understandably, on what he knows as a policeman, on criminals that are well identified. But that's a fragment. And there are many, many, many more out there that he knows nothing about. My point to you is if you listen to President Trump, listen to what he says, and then ask yourself, what has he done? Remember, he said, when I was president, I built the wall. No, he didn't. Now he's saying, see, you don't see people pouring into the country. But he's missing something. All the illegal ports of entry are being used by the drug cartels to move drugs and human trafficking into the United States, and also being used to bring in truckloads of cash from the United States into Mexico. What I'm trying to tell you is optics are one thing, reality is another. President Trump has always been very much about optics. And optics right now in the United States are these magnificent pictures of aircraft carrier battle groups steaming through pristine waters in beautiful sunshine with all these airplanes. But we have learned over many, many decades, the ultimate impact of these things is minimal, if any.
Yeah, he's right. I think he's getting at the fact that doesn't create regime change. It's like these bombing campaigns, even if it's a big time carpet bombing campaign to take off mass facilities, not targeted strikes, like a massive bombing campaign. There's no evidence where that ever led to a regime change, as far as I'm aware. If you know of one that I don't, let me know in the comments below, because I don't think that's ever happened. It would legitimately take boots on the ground, which we cannot afford to do. The U.S. can't afford to get involved in another military theater right now. It would be disastrous. It would really be his George W. Bush invade Iraq moment. It truly would be. So it's just alarming to even consider that. I hope that's not even on the table of his considerations right now. But at the same time, if it's just strikes, if it's just bomb campaigns, if it's just activity like that, this could go on for years and years and years and years with no end. Another money laundering scheme for the military-industrial complex that ends up 20 plus years like Afghanistan or Iraq. That is a big fear. And Iran touching U.S. troops in the region is a big fear of mine. They shouldn't be there in the first place. Obviously, I support bring the troops home now, shut down all those foreign-based bases in the Middle East. But we don't live in that world. So bombing would be a horrible, horrible situation, or putting boots on the ground would be horrible. I think there's more of a chance of this being drawn out as a long-term military money sink if it's just bombing.
And again, we go back to the original point. You talked about how do you support this? How do you rearm? How do you replenish? It's very difficult. We're betting once again too much on what the Israelis bet on to begin with. A knockout blow. Big mistake. This is a continental power. It can absorb serious punishment.
Yeah.
And it will fight back. What happens when we do start to take losses? What happens if we lose any capital ships? What happens when the bases that we occupy are blown up? Then the Americans who are otherwise enjoying their beer and watching the game will say, wait a minute, what's this? How many of us were killed? Why? What are we doing there? I don't remember being asked about this. Was there any debate in Congress? No. Mr. Netanyahu owns Congress. There's no debate. They're all lining up to have their pockets filled with cash and doing whatever Mr. Netanyahu wants. And so is Mr. Trump.
It's so true. I hate to say it, but this is not a issue that elected officials campaigned on by any stretch. Even neocons didn't go out to their constituents and said, yeah, I want regime change in Iran. No, that always happens after they get elected because they know that Americans don't generally support that without a corresponding propaganda campaign. But they have started a propaganda campaign saying, bringing back the nuclear weapons thing after denying that it was close 6 weeks ago. You see that. You see the big part of the campaign now to sell this war is chants. They chant death to America. Iranians chant that, which is somehow supposed to be a threat to the U.S. And it's not. There's no way for Iran to strike the U.S. from Iran. It's about Israel. It's always been about Israel, Netanyahu pulling us in. But chants in and of themselves, it's so weird to see right-wing fears about this. Right-wingers that said, words aren't violence. That, leftists that say that, that words are violence are idiot wokesters. But they make those same arguments when it comes to Iran propaganda. It's crazy that those chants are somehow worse than committing genocide or regime change operations or bombing throughout the world or funding proxy wars to the tune of $200 billion. It's the chants that they're afraid of. That is so ludicrous to me.
At this point, though, do you think the Americans or Israelis could use a tactical nuclear weapon?
I think there's a real possibility that in desperation, the Israelis will. And ultimately, there may be voices arguing for that. That's why I mentioned the MRR, minimal residual radiation, low yield nuclear warheads. There could be. I think it's a very serious mistake. I think that's a degree of escalation that we should not move to under any circumstances. But remember, you're dealing with arrogance and self-delusion. That's a dangerous combination that inevitably results in failure. And we are all about arrogance, all about self-delusion. I wish it were not the case, but it is.
Yeah, I'm mostly with Macgregor here. This is a fool's errand to get into this war. It always has been. It's not America first by any stretch. It's America last. It defies a lot of the rhetoric Trump used on the campaign trail, saying that, he wasn't going to launch new wars. And one of the biggest things and most common things that Trump supporters would say to promote Trump when he was in that electoral contest was he didn't start a new war, which, was only half truthful. He technically didn't start a new war. He expanded theaters and several others, but he didn't start a new war. And that is a redeemable quality of Trump. At least it was leading up to that point. He didn't do so good in terms of using one of his only vetoes to keep the war in Yemen going, expanding the war in Syria, expanding the war in Yemen, ramping up bombing in Afghanistan at certain points too, before that withdrawal happened finally under Biden. That was a disaster, but I guess at least U.S. troops are out of there now. But we'll have to see how this plays out. Now, there's a stark contrast between John Mearsheimer, who believes that Trump's rhetoric toning down in the last few days is an indicator that he's actually reconsidering attacking Iran. But you have Douglas Macgregor, who is very confident that the decision's already made. It's only a matter of time. They're gathering resources, and there will be a U.S. bombing campaign against Iran. I don't know where I fall yet. I think I lean more toward Macgregor because I've seen more of the indications of military resources moving into that area of the world, including B-2 bombers, including battle groups like he talked about in this podcast. That seems to indicate they are going to do something. But I don't deny Mearsheimer's point that Trump hasn't really talked very bellicose lately. I don't think that how Trump talks on social media, though, all the time is very indicative of what's going to play out politically. It's part of Trump's weird art of the deal strategy. There's no deal to be made, it seems like now. You know, I'll eat crow if I'm wrong, but I think in some ways we're past the point of no return here with Israel actually striking Iran. So we'll have to see how this plays out. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think there's any chance that the U.S. will not bomb Iran, that they will somehow find a way out of this situation just as a support role, or even bring Iran back to the table somehow for additional negotiations? That option seems more and more distant every day, but I do want to hear from you on that. Let me know in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and please consider supporting me as a YouTube member or as a Patreon patron. That would go a long way to support the channel, and I would really appreciate it. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.